So the following is going to be an example of how I would talk about the ancient Near East in the context of the course in the Jerusalem Center. Not necessarily a lecture by scholars for scholars, but an example of how I would explain a certain concept to the students at the center if we were teaching that class. So the topic that I've decided to talk about is the context of 1st century CE Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and how different political, social, religious contexts and allegiances of the different groups that Jesus preached to can help us understand their reactions to him as Messiah. To begin, we need to talk about the broad kind of macro context of the people of Israel from the very earliest times of the Abrahamic covenant all the way through the 1st century CE of the Holy Land in Jerusalem. So if we go back, we talk about the covenant of Abraham, that happens, right? And very, very shortly after kind of the time of the patriarchs, we begin a process of political oppression and non-independence for the Jewish people, despite the promise of Eretz Israel, having the land of Israel as part of the covenant of Abraham. So, we're talking about Egypt, right? Then there's this big Passover, which is awesome, and there's a period of independence, and there's a golden age with David and Solomon and all this stuff, and then we have just empires coming in, right, all the time. We've got Assyria, we've got Babylon, we've got Persia, we've got Greece, right? Then we have another short period of kind of reliving this wonderful golden age with the Hasmoneans, okay? And then again, surprise, surprise, we start this kind of pattern all over again with the Romans, okay? So we have this pattern established. Understanding the different groups in the New Testament relies a lot on this pattern, okay? So to go in a little more detail into this little microcosmic section of this macro pattern, okay? We have the Greeks, and during the Greek Empire and their Hellenization of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, there were a couple of reactions that had been, that were part of groups that had been forming prior to that Greek Empire, but really kind of exploded during that time, especially in the context of 1st century CE Judaism, or Jerusalem rather. So Sakari, we'll leave them kind of off to the side. We'll talk about those another time. But these 4 groups are often talked about in the New Testament, these 2 especially, but understanding where they come from in the context of the Greek Empire is important. So when the Greek Empire comes into Jerusalem, they begin a process of Greekification or Hellenization of their entire empire, which kind of spans from North Africa all the way to the steppes of India, and Jerusalem was part of that, certainly. So the Greeks in their Hellenization brought this culture that was quite secular. We're talking about gymnasiums and exercising naked. It was crazy. So conservative religious Jews at the time decided to react against this trend of Hellenization, and this group kind of allied itself, or kind of grew out of a group called the Pharisees, right? Sometimes some scholars say this comes from the Hebrew word prushim, which means kind of standing apart, right? But the Pharisees had been a group that had believed in the oral Torah, as opposed to the Sadducees who believed in strictly the written Torah. But this group became religiously conservative, okay? So when we talk about the Pharisees, we're talking about religiously conservative people who reacted against the Hellenization and the secularization trends of Hellenization during the Greek Empire. And this lasted kind of through the Hasmonean dynasty. The Sadducees were wealthy elite, kind of cultural elites that were smaller in number, often on the Sanhedrin, and they loved Hellenism. Okay, they loved the cultural kind of context, the wealth that it brought, the kind of the internationalization, all these different things. Language, people were speaking Greek, it's great. The Sadducees also only believed in the Torah that was written, not the Torah that was oral. And so these groups were kind of opposed to one another. We often clump them together like, oh, Pharisees and Sadducees. No, like you would ask a Pharisee a question, and most of the time they probably would have said different things than a Sadducee would have said. Okay, now a little more context about this will help us understand the Essenes. When the Greeks were defeated by the Hasmoneans, they set up this ruling empire that also housed the priesthood. Okay, so the high priest came from this family. So when we're talking about the Hasmoneans, we're talking about a group to which the Jewish people have almost a religious obligation, or at the very least a religious motivation to ally themselves to, right? So when the Hasmoneans kind of dwindle and Rome kind of takes over, Rome is looking for somebody, a local person, to kind of run things, okay? So what happens is in the context of Rome, right, there's a guy named Antipater who comes from, if we look at a map of the Holy Land, this is kind of Mediterranean coast, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Down here, this whole area is Idumea, okay? Idumea is the land of the descendants of Esau, brother of Jacob, not necessarily the inheritor of the Abrahamic covenant, but still kind of like, distant ancient cousins of the Jewish people. Antipater was an Idumean, okay? So strictly speaking, a non-Jew, right? And for political reasons, he marries somebody also from the southern area, princess of the Nabateans, people who were in Petra, if you remember Indiana Jones and Petra. So they have a son together, and his name is Herod. Herod the Great is the son of a father who's an Idumean and a mother who's an Arab. Okay, so definitely not Jewish. So he comes in, has Roman allegiance. He was really good friends with Mark Antony, and he needs the allegiance of the Jews at the time. So in order to do that, he marries a Hasmonean princess. This kind of empire, this family is not dead. It's just that their political power has waned because of a lot of infighting and the rise of the Roman Empire as well. There's lots of reasons. So he marries Mariamne, actually sends his current wife out and the family and says, okay, I'm going to marry this other lady to have political power in Jerusalem. So during the life of Herod the Great, he has a son with Mariamne. He becomes very popular, becomes high priest. This is a big deal. But people are seeing that the priesthood is now the result of a marriage that may have one of the sides of the line coming from a legitimate Jewish background, rather than this Hasmonean dynasty through the mother, but at the same time, this dad is half Arab, half Idumean. Like, this is weird. So the Essenes, for this and many other reasons, like myriad reasons, the Essenes kind of basically come to the conclusion the priesthood in Jerusalem is kaput, right? It's like not what it should be, and therefore the temple and the rituals therein, the sacrifices, they've lost their efficacy in the eyes of the Lord because of the worthiness of the people that are perpetuating them. And so they decide to leave and go to the desert. They go to places like Qumran, which we'll go to. You probably have already gone there. I don't know what the students will do at this point. And they start writing scriptures. They wear special clothes. They ritually bathe in mikvahs a lot. I mean, they're just living worthily, anticipating a time when the priesthood and the worthy exercise thereof will be restored. Okay, so basically these guys think everybody's an apostate. We just need to do our own thing. The Zealots look at this pattern of all of these empires, and they're taking over, and they're what they see as the oppression of the Jewish people, and they see this beautiful little kind of renaissance of Davidic and Solomonic independence of the people of Israel, and oh my gosh, Rome, so similar to Greece in its in its culture, right? When we talk about Greco-Roman culture being so similar, that it's like, we can't have this. Zealots are going to do whatever we can to have political independence from these sources, right? And there are many motivations for the Zealots' reasoning, but primarily the idea of the Zealots is we want you out. We want to have our own control of our own thing, whether it is primarily religious or primarily political, whatever it was. And again, these, with the exception of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, the Zealots kind of permeate many categories, right? And they're not always exactly separated, these groups. These two definitely are, though. So if we go with this understanding of the political complexities of the time, right? You've got people who are allied to Herod, the Herodians, and Herod is allied to Rome, but also to the Hasmonean dynasty via his wife, who he eventually kills for supposed adultery. Then he kills his sons, it's the worst. Then you got people who are allied to Rome specifically. Then you've got the Sadducees who are kind of hoping for the return of the heyday of Hellenism. Then you've got the Pharisees who are these religious conservatives who are saying, no, we need to be hyper involved in the minutia of Jewish law, and the emphasis and the uncovering the discovery of the living oral Torah that was passed down with the written Torah from Moses. And then we've got the Zealots. It's like, I don't care what you do. I just want to be independent politically. This is whatever. So when Jesus comes, Jesus of Nazareth, and his messiahship becomes uncovered and revealed to these people, or at least his claims thereto to them, these contexts from which they're coming inform their expectations of what a Messiah would be. And again, we've probably already talked about this, and I'm sure many of the people in the class will already have known this, but Messiah, in Hebrew, Mashiach, just means anointed one. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, there are a fair few names who are referred to by this title as a symbol of power and kingship. Even Cyrus the Great was called Messiah at some point, an anointed person. So expectations of these groups, based on the historical context and the contemporary political context of the day, would certainly have different expectations of what the Messiah should be, or at least a Messiah should be. And so understanding these contexts can help us understand why different people might have had a problem with who Jesus was and what he represented based on their expectations not being congruent with what he was. So the way I would probably teach this to the students is this. I would have them divide into groups, 1, 2, 3, 4 groups at least, maybe more, right? And with whatever group they pertain to in this activity, we would do kind of an activity where we start with a comparison between extant scriptures of first century Judaism available to the Jews at the time of messiahship, right? With every kind of at least a few of these scriptures that describe what Messiah could be, leaving it open to the interpretation that would be informed by the primary source documents of these groups. Okay, so if we have primary source inscriptions from Josephus and others, right, describing who the Pharisees were, who the Sadducees were, what they stood for, their context, and reading these primary source documents, triangulating with contemporary scripture available to first century Jews, we would come up with a list of, the students would at least, expectations of Messiah, right? And so with these two things informing this kind of extrapolated concept and pulling out these principles of what might a typical first century Jewish Pharisee expect based on the scriptures that are available to them and the context in which they're coming from of a Messiah. And how might that jive or not jive with who Jesus of Nazareth was and the things that he said. And then based off this, we would review several stories in the New Testament, like the time when in the Galilee, Jesus was in the house and the guy was lowered through the roof and he forgave the sins of this person, and there was some mumbling among some of the locals about how Jesus could forgive sins. It's like, well, it would be obvious, or at least more clear to a student who had understood the context from which some of these groups came, to say, well, I can understand why they might have had a problem with Jesus claiming to forgive sins because oral Torah says this, or what, you know what I mean? So knowing that could not only more richly inform their understanding of the New Testament, but also develop a compassionate viewpoint toward these first century Jews. And despite what it says in the Book of Mormon in Jacob 4 about how the Jews were kind of looking for things that they couldn't understand and God gave it to them and all these things, and the complexity of that time period, could maybe develop a little bit more compassion and understand, these people weren't just evil. They had expectations and context that led them to believe certain things that maybe didn't jive with what God's plan was. And then the ultimate point of all this scholarship is to say, well, what can I learn about my expectations of the role of Messiah in my life, and how could I maybe jettison some of these expectations and change and become more kind of parallel and congruent with who Jesus really is, and not superimpose my expectations on Messiah. One time when I was in yeshiva in Jerusalem, I was in a rabbinic ordination school. It's called Simchat Shlomo, and we had a lesson from Rabbi Fink from Finland, who basically said there was the question on the table of what Messiah would look like when he came. And these Orthodox Jews and I were studying about this, and the conclusion that Rabbi Fink came to was a ruling from a recent posek that said that Messiah will come in a way that he will actually magically look like whatever Messiah you're expecting him to look like. So if you're a religious Zionist, he will dress like a religious Zionist. If you're a Lithuanian Orthodox Jew, he will dress with a shtreimel, a conservative, like whatever you dress like, whatever you expect him to be, he will appear that way to you. And it was interesting to hear that and to kind of juxtapose that with kind of the appearance of the Messiah in the first century CE, because rather than understand that Jesus kind of becomes what we want him to become, to flip that on its head and say, well, maybe it would be better to have us become ready to see him as he is.